Grant Robertson.
David Bennett's very conscious of words, the importance of words that people might say and how they'll come back to haunt him. But there was one word he didn't want to utter, and there were two words: tax and petrol tax, because that's actually what this bill is about. I said it was two. I did correct myself. Two words. Thank goodness the Minister of Education's here to keep us on track. We'll come to the contingencies, but the words that Mr. Bennett doesn't want to say are petrol tax and raising petrol tax. He didn't mention that once, Mr. Speaker, and that is exactly what this bill does. But I'm not surprised that he didn't mention it, because he wouldn't want to get offside with his leader, John Key, who, of course, also doesn't want to mention that what this bill does is put up petrol taxes to ensure that the National Party can create its wafer-thin surplus. Because the whole notion of what was going to happen with taxation under this government is something that John Key doesn't want to talk about. But in 2005, this is what he said. He was talking about taxation, and he said, what we have to avoid is the indifference to the burden that taxation heaps on middle-income families. Well, what does this do? What does this legislation do, Mr. Speaker? What this legislation does is exactly that. It heaps the burden on middle-income families. These are the same families, Mr. Speaker, who missed out on a tax cut when the National Party came into office. These are the same families who looked on while the top 10% of taxpayers got 40% of the benefit. That's what happened. That's the squeeze that was put on the middle-income families that John Key suddenly said he felt for. But then when they got into government, Mr. Speaker, Bill English said, we don't want to go down the route of raising taxes. That's what Bill English said. Well, what did he do? He put GST up. And who did that put the squeeze on, Mr. Speaker? Low and middle income families. The people who spend more of their income on the basics. Not the National Party's mates who can take that money and go away on their overseas trips, but the middle and low income families who got squeezed by a tax increase that National said that they wouldn't do. But then, Mr. Speaker, they're the same people who are being squeezed by a 20% increase in early childhood education costs, by increase in prescription charges. And this government likes to say we're getting into surplus, wafer thin as it may be. Well, it is off the backs of hard-working New Zealanders who haven't had a break from this government. And they are shifting the burden, Mr. Speaker. They are shifting the burden from their debt to New Zealanders' bank accounts, Mr. Speaker. That's what this bill does. And, Mr. Speaker, that's why the Labour Party is strongly opposed to this bill. And I am very surprised that there are parties in this House who oppose the government's budget but think that they can vote for this legislation. Mr. Speaker, I think it is naive to lift this bill out and say, oh, well, it puts petrol taxes up. We might think that's a good idea in principle. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is a hoax. It's not about the petrol taxes, really, is it, Mr. Brownlee? It's about the political surplus. It's about trying to make sure that a wafer-thin surplus is provided to meet a political commitment that this government has made. Because the reality is this bill has to be seen in the context of the rest of the budget, Mr. Speaker. It has to be seen in the context of a budget that delivers to Nationals' vested interests rather than ordinary New Zealanders, that further creates the two-speed economy, where the speculators and the vested interests benefit, and when the exporters and the manufacturers and the ordinary New Zealanders go in the slow lane. That's what this is about. This is about a budget where there was an absolute failure to create policies for affordable housing. An absolute failure. The government promised big and delivered very, very little. This is a budget where there was an absolute failure to address issues of poverty. Great claims made about food in schools, and nothing shows up on budget day about that. Great claims made about what will be done to get warrant of fitnesses for rental housing, and they're considering a pilot. A consideration of a pilot. That's the context of this bill, Mr. Speaker. That's what people and members in this House should be thinking about as to whether they vote for this bill. To focus and accept the government's fiddle and fudge to say this is about making sure that we get money for these roads of significance to national, or roads of national significance, whichever way you want to put it around. Yes, that's what they want to claim of it, but the reality is that this is a taxation bill that is part of this government's budget. It is vital to their ability to drive their agenda through. And parties on this side of the House should think very carefully, Mr Speaker, about whether they want to support National's budget, because that's what they will be doing if they vote for this legislation. They will not just be voting to increase petrol taxes. Mind you, they will be doing that, which will put further pressure on middle-income families, Mr Speaker. But they will be voting for a budget that is utterly bereft of ideas to create jobs. And, Mr Speaker, the two-speed economy I mentioned earlier is relevant to this legislation, because, as has been discussed before, it's the people in regional New Zealand who miss out on the transport policies of this government. It's the people in regional New Zealand, and my colleague Phil Twyford, when he was Labour's transport spokesperson, and Ian Lees-Galloway now, have been going around the country talking to the local authorities in the regions, talking to the businesses in the regions of New Zealand, and they are saying a consistent thing. The same thing that I've been told going around talking to Polytechs, talking to the Chambers of Commerce, talking to the businesses about skills and training. This government's ignoring them. This government is ignoring the regions. It's only interested in working with its vested interest mates. And those regions are also not benefiting from this transport policy. As my colleague Ian Lees-Galloway has said before, a transport policy needs to be a balanced policy. Yes, there needs to be some funding for roads, but there needs to be support for public transport. There needs to be support for walking and cycling. That's absent from this government's plan, Mr Speaker. It's so limited. There's no balance. David Bennett says it's not true. What's the percentage that is spent on rail out of the transport budget? 7% of the transport budget is spent on rail. This is not a balanced policy. But, Mr Speaker, the balance that's really missing here is the balance that would give ordinary middle-income and low-income families a fair go, and regional New Zealand a fair go. And David Bennett, for all of his bluff and bluster, cannot make the case for the fact that this bill is good for his constituents. People in Hamilton, people in the Waikato, they are saying, where is this national government? This national government is far more focused on deals with Sky City, selling off laws to Warner Brothers, selling off the right to protest to international companies, as we've seen in the last few days. That's the focus of the national government. They have ignored the regions of New Zealand, and this piece of legislation is one more example of that, Mr Speaker. So I strongly urge parties in this House to oppose this legislation. This is not legislation that will deliver for New Zealanders, and it cannot be isolated out from the rest of this government's program and the rest of what it is doing. Mr Speaker, this government has a record of broken promises when it comes to taxation. They have come to this House today with a bill that increases taxes on petrol this year, next year, the year after, and Mr Speaker, that will result in pressure on middle-income households. And there is nothing else in this budget that New Zealanders could look at and say, OK, maybe they're putting my petrol tax up here, but I'm going to see some delivery. I'm going to see some new jobs created. That means I can support a petrol tax going up. But that's not there, Mr Speaker. On the jobs front, this budget is hilarious, Mr Speaker. If it weren't so serious, it would be absolutely hilarious. We have discovered in the budget figures the national government will pull up 60,000 jobs short of their target of 170,000 new jobs. That's bad enough, Mr Speaker, but then they've recommitted to a new target for 4 years with 170,000 jobs again. They won't do it. They don't have the policies to create jobs. They don't have the ideas and the innovation to turn this economy around, to make the changes to monetary policy, to change procurement policy so it focuses on New Zealand jobs. They're not prepared to tax capital through the capital gains tax. All they're prepared to do, Mr Speaker, is tinker around at the edges and benefit vested interests. This bill is critical to that budget, and it should be opposed because it does not deliver to ordinary New Zealanders the kind of benefits they should expect from a budget like this.
Julie Ann Genter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There are two very different reasons